When a calm mind turns cold, it rarely happens with noise. It is not a storm, not a sudden rupture, not the dramatic explosion we romanticize in movies. It begins quietly. So quietly, in fact, that most people never notice the moment it happens. They only feel the aftermath, the slow fading of warmth, the silent retreat of presence, the eyes that once sparkled now resting on you like unmoved glass. And if you have ever been on either end of that shift, you know the unsettling truth. Detachment is not the opposite of care. It is what remains after care has burned itself to exhaustion. There is something profoundly human about the moment a person stops begging to be understood, when they stop fighting for a seat at a table where their voice has been repeatedly ignored, when they stop offering explanations, excuses, second chances. It is not anger. Anger still cares. Anger still hopes for change. Detachment is what comes after the heart realizes that no amount of hope can rewrite certain realities. And yet, beneath its stillness lies one of the most misunderstood transformations in psychology, the shift from reactive emotion to cold neutrality. People often picture detachment as a dramatic withdrawal, a sudden disappearance, a slammed door, a blocked number. But the science behind detachment shows something more subtle. The mind doesn't cut ties like a blade through rope. It releases them one thread at a time. The brain, exhausted by repeated emotional overload, begins to protect itself. Hormonal responses shift. Cortisol spikes gradually flatten. Dopamine rewards tied to a person or situation weaken. The neural pathways that once fired with anticipation begin to dim like streetlights at dawn. What was once emotionally charged becomes neurologically neutral. And this neutrality, this coldness, is not cruelty. It is survival. But what does that moment feel like from the inside? Imagine carrying water in your hands for years, trying desperately not to lose a single drop. You tighten your fingers. You clench your palms. You adjust your grip again and again. At some point, the water still slips through, leaving your hands empty and trembling. And suddenly, it hits you. There is no technique left to try, no method you haven't attempted. The water was never yours to hold, and something in you finally exhales, long and low. That exhale is the beginning of detachment, the surrender of a burden you were never meant to carry alone. For some, detachment arrives after betrayal. For others, after chronic disappointment. For many, after years of being the emotional anchor for people who never learned to stand on their own. You reach a point where your empathy has been stretched so far, it begins to fray. That fraying is not a failure. It's evidence of how deeply you engaged, how fully you tried. But every attempt has a limit. And when you reach that limit, the calm that follows is not softness. It is the cold clarity of someone who has finally stopped trying to rewrite the same chapter. The mind, once overwhelmed, begins to reroute. It shifts from emotional processing to cognitive distance. It starts observing instead of absorbing. You listen to the same words, but they no longer echo inside you. You witness the same behaviors, but they no longer destabilize your peace. This is not numbness. Numbness feels like absence. Detachment feels like presence without vulnerability. You are still there, just not available to be wounded in the same places. What makes this transformation so powerful is that it rarely announces itself. You wake up one morning and realize you did not check your phone anxiously. You hear a familiar excuse and feel no surge of adrenaline. You encounter a situation that used to unravel you and notice, with almost eerie calm, that your heartbeat remains steady. It is in these small, quiet reactions that you meet the new version of yourself, the version that learned to protect its own oxygen before tending to another's fire. Some people mistake this shift as coldness, even cruelty, because they are accustomed to the warmth you once gave freely. They remember the version of you who over-explained, over-apologized, overextended, and now, faced with your calm, they interpret your silence as punishment. But it isn't. Silence is simply what remains when the mind has run out of words that make a difference. Detachment is not an act done to them. It is a recalibration done for yourself. Scientists call this process adaptive distancing. Therapists call it emotional boundaries. But but real people call it something simpler. I'm done. It is the point where your peace begins to matter more than your patterns, where you stop trying to prove your worth to those determined not to see it, where you stop shrinking your needs to fit someone else's comfort. That pivot from external validation to internal stability is one of the most powerful shifts a human mind can make. And yet, for all its strength, detachment is not heartlessness. A detached mind still feels. It simply refuses to feel on command. It no longer hands over its emotional keys to people who drive it into walls. It no longer spends sleepless nights replaying conversations with someone who slept just fine. It no longer pours energy into fixing what benefits from staying broken. In this coldness, there is a strange kind of warmth, a warmth directed inward at last. Some people experience this shift as liberation. Others experience it as a quiet grief. Because letting go of attachment is also letting go of the future you imagine. Detachment forces you to confront truths without the cushion of hope. You see people as they are, not as you wished they would be. You see situations with the clarity you once avoided. It is not always painless, but it is honest. And honesty, even when it is cold, is cleaner than chaos wrapped in comfort. The true power of detachment is that it redefines your center of gravity. You no longer tilt emotionally toward other people's storms. You no longer collapse under the weight of their expectations. You no longer negotiate your self-worth through their acceptance. Instead, you stand in a steadiness that cannot be manipulated because it does not depend on external approval. This steadiness feels cold at first, like stepping into shade after standing in relentless sun. But given time, you realize it is not coldness at all. It is relief. And perhaps that is the deepest secret behind calm minds turning cold. They have tasted the exhaustion of carrying too hard for too long. They have spent years carrying emotional loads that were never reciprocated, never acknowledged, never shared. Eventually, the mind makes a choice, not a loud one, not an angry one, but a quiet internal shift. This is where I stop losing myself. It is in that moment, small, almost imperceptible, that detachment begins its work, not by shutting the world out, but by letting the self back in. In the days that follow a shift like this, something subtle begins to change in the way you move through the world. You notice it first in your reactions, those small internal flickers that once betrayed you, the hesitation before answering, the quickening of breath, the silent rehearsals of what to say or how to avoid conflict. But now those reflexes begin to quiet. You respond without overthinking, or you do not respond at all, and neither choice feels like a loss. Your silence is no longer a battlefield. It becomes a sanctuary where your nervous system finally rests after years of being on high alert. Detachment teaches the body what the mind took too long to learn, that peace is not passive. It is a discipline. And like any discipline, it requires unlearning old habits. You begin noticing how often you once opened your door to chaos simply because you hoped it would behave differently this time. How many times you interpreted inconsistency as potential, indifference as stress, or manipulation as misunderstanding. But in your new clarity, the excuses evaporate. You see patterns for what they are, not what you emotionally wish them to be. That shift feels cold at first, almost uncomfortably rational, but beneath it is a strange sensation of alignment, as though your mind and your instincts are finally speaking the same language. There is a moment, often unexpected, when you realize you no longer crave explanations. You no longer replay how things fell apart or wonder what you could have done differently. Detachment gives you permission to stop rewriting a past that cannot be changed, and in that release you begin to recover pieces of yourself you didn't even realize you had handed away. Little pieces, your laughter, your curiosity, your softness, the way you once walked through the world without bracing for impact. Those pieces return slowly, like birds approaching a quiet field after a long storm, and as they return, You feel something you haven't felt in years. Space. Space to breathe without waiting for the next emotional ambush. Space to think without someone else's voice drowning your own. Space to imagine a life where your value is not negotiated, where your love is not a currency that must be spent to earn basic respect. This space is where healing begins, not with dramatic declarations, not with sudden revelations, but with the simple, steady reinstatement of your own autonomy. But detachment is not a finish line, it is a threshold, and crossing it brings you face to face with one of the hardest lessons of emotional growth. The realization that not everyone you cared for was meant to stay. Some people were meant to teach you what love shouldn't feel like. Others were meant to guide you toward boundaries you had never known how to set. And a few were meant to show you, painfully and unmistakably, that loyalty without reciprocity is a slow form of self-erasure. Standing in this threshold, you begin to see relationships differently. You see how often people demand emotional access without offering emotional responsibility. How often they want the version of you that serves their comfort, not the version that protects your sanity. When your mind grows cold, not cruel, just clear, the dynamics shift. You stop participating in conversations designed to pull you into old roles. You stop offering emotional labor to people who treat it as entitlement. You stop letting guilt masquerade as love. Some people react strongly to this change. They call you distant, ungrateful, dramatic. They accuse you of changing, as though growth were an offense rather than a necessity. But their reactions reveal something deeper. They were never invested in your well-being, only in your availability. They were drawn to your warmth, your willingness, your patience. And now that your energy has been rerouted back to yourself, their access is no longer effortless. This is when the coldness becomes visible, not because you have become harsh, but because you have become selective. This selectivity is one of the quiet strengths of a detached mind. You learn to differentiate between those who genuinely care and those who merely benefit. You stop confusing intensity with intimacy. You stop mistaking proximity for connection. And you begin to understand that a person's inconsistency is not a puzzle to be solved, but a pattern to be recognized. Once you see this pattern, you cannot unsee it. And in that vision, detachment stops feeling like a loss and starts feeling like liberation. What surprises many people is that detachment eventually brings softness, not toward others, but toward yourself. You begin to forgive yourself for staying too long, for caring too much, for ignoring the signs your body noticed long before your mind accepted them. You start honoring your intuition, that quiet internal compass that always knew when something wasn't right. Detachment gives it a voice again, a calm, steady voice that guides you, not with fear, but with clarity. And clarity changes everything. It changes the way you answer the phone when certain names appear. It changes the way your heart reacts when someone tries to pull you back into old emotional narratives. It changes the way you walk into rooms where you once shrank your presence. You stand differently. You speak differently. You choose differently. Not out of bitterness, but out of alignment. Eventually, you reach a point where the coldness dissolves into something warmer, a grounded calm that cannot be shaken. You realize you are no longer detached from life. You are detached from what hurts you. You are no longer withdrawing from connection. You are withdrawing from chaos. You are no longer shutting down. You are showing up for yourself. And in this renewed presence, something remarkable happens. You begin to attract a different kind of world. People who respect your boundaries instead of testing them. Situations that reward your self-respect instead of punishing it. Environments where your peace is not an inconvenience, but a necessity. This is the final transformation, the return of warmth, not as vulnerability, but as choice. When calm minds turn cold, it is never the end of who you are. It is the end of who you had to be in order to survive. And once that version of you lays down its burdens, what rises in its place is not hardness but sovereignty, the ability to care without losing yourself, to love without abandoning your truth, to walk away without collapsing under the weight of guilt. Detachment is not the death of emotion, it is the reclamation of it, and in that reclamation you finally understand that the coldness was never the destination. It was the doorway back to yourself.